Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Quest for the Bestest. It's the podcast from Backlot Banter, where us four Backlot boys, me, Timo here at the remote location, and Tucker, Tanner, and Abram there live from the BLB headquarters. We are going to talk about Anatomy of a Fall today. If you saw the end of last week's episode, you'll know that we have upset the gods of random chance.
So early on in the show.
Yes, we have dared to rebuke them because we want to watch the current Palme d'Or winner in the theaters and talk about in a timely manner for you guys, put out a review when it makes sense. So we fudged the numbers a little bit, but next week, don't worry, Barton Fink will be back. As a result, Fart and Stink. I do think a little spoiler is that there's no spin wheel coming because we already know what happened, what we're watching next week.
This happened when we reviewed Gigi like 2 years ago.
I'm heartbroken, but when is that not the case?
We've got to do it. We've got to do it because we got to talk about this movie, Anatomy of a Fall. It's this year's Palme d'Or winner, directed by Justine Triet. It is quite the it's a whodunit in a sort of a
I
sense.
guess so.
Did Who Done It?
Did who done it?
Did whodunit?
It's a courtroom drama, is what it is.
Yes, and well, we might have some courtroom drama enjoyers or some haters in the attendance here.
Whoa.
But to remind you of what happened last time, The Ballad of Narayama, we thought was a very interesting movie upon further reflection, but it got a score of a 7.9, so squarely at the second spot on our list. And Parasite, our first film that we reviewed, with a 9.9, still sitting at spot number 1. So Anatomy of a Fall has a chance to end up at either the first, second, or third spot.
That's true.
On the list.
I'd say it's more likely than not 2 of the spots as opposed to 1 of them. But, hey, you never know.
We shall see. And as longtime Quest viewers might know, we like to feature a comment from previous episodes of someone who says something that we particularly like or disagree with. And so I do believe we have a comment from the very first episode of Quest Series Dose that Abram is going to read out loud for us
This
right
comes from at Abby Keg, who is a friend of the show.
Yes.
Mystery woman, I don't know who that is.
How many people do we have that aren't friends of the show? If they're watching our show, they're a friend of the show.
There are a couple
That's
of you
fair
who
enough.
are enemies of the show, and you should know who you are.
That's fair
Enemies of
enough. But Abby, friend, not enemy of the show, says, crazy how I haven't seen Parasite in years, and yet it's still so fresh in the mind. Also, my boyfriend pissed me off about this movie because his take is just, quote, don't be stinky, though he's just decidedly being obnoxious and contrarian because he knows I like it. Great review. Excited for the Ballad of Narayama. Hope it lived up to expectations, Abby, which I recently heard about through Mubi, but has since been taken off their library.
Shout out, sponsored.
I lied. It's still on Mubi. I just ended my subscription. That would do it.
Okay.
That would do it. Make it
do
hard
it.
to watch at the end of your subscription. But
What if we could get sponsored by a movie? I feel like that's we're the kind of podcast they'd want to,
could.
like, hey, get some
Who
cinephiles.
else
on
is-
there.
I don't think that's true at all. I don't think they want us. I don't think Mubi wants us.
Here you go, Abram. They might want this show.
Sure, they could acquire. I'm open to an acquisition.
Oh.
I just don't
Yeah,
think
yeah.
a sponsorship's gonna happen.
What if they bought the show, but then just replaced all of us?
Oh,
Well, how much?
classic blunder.
How much did they pay for the acquisition? Is really the question.
It's like $45.
I'll
take it.
$1 million.
Okay, let's talk about the movie. What do we watch? Anatomy of a Fall.
That's the one.
Yes.
Anatomy of a Fall, this year's Palme d'Or winner. Who wants to go first? I know who I want to go
all
first.
right.
I want Mr. Center, Save Ferris Bueller,
hello.
Tucker Hazel himself.
Everyone, thank you
right
for
there in
having
the
me.
center.
So glad to be here.
It's Mr. Center. We all know him. We all love him. Mr. Center.
We love
So,
Mr.
Timo, if I'm
Center.
hearing right,
What
know
did you
anything
think?
about Anatomy of a Fall?
Yeah.
Is that, am I gathering that? Okay, all right. Anatomy
yes,
of a Fall. I just want to keep things clear,
Fair enough.
Anatomy of a Fall, I realized as this movie started, no idea what it's about. I was like, I thought it was Zone of Interest. I got the two of them mixed up in my mind. I'm like, I thought this was like a period piece and like, Nazi
Sandra
Germany.
Hüller
Like,
in
what
both.
happened?
Sure.
And so I was confused. But then, as it went along, it obviously started making more and more sense. The plot kind of revealed itself about 20 minutes into the movie. It's like it's a pretty solid chunk in. And when I realized that it was a plot beat by plot beat trying to figure out what happened in this forensic case of a potential murder, I was like, you can't You can't just do that to me. You can't just spring a courtroom drama out of nowhere when I was expecting Nazis instead. I got a courtroom drama. And I was pleasantly surprised because not only do I love courtroom dramas, 12 Angry Men, not Kramer vs. Kramer, we reviewed that. That's not one of my favorites, but
Anatomy of a Murder.
Anatomy of a Murder, which I was like, they could have named it that, but it was taken. Those kind of movies, My Cousin Vinny, I love courtroom drama.
Witness for the prosecution.
But I love that genre.
Good.
It's something about the methodical nature and the pointed scripts and very focused performances and sort of minimalist approach to set design and shot composition really grabs me and keeps me engrossed. And so as the film like more and more leans into the courtroom drama, I just got getting more and more interested. And I think it's a fascinating movie in its structure, especially as someone who, again, didn't know what it was about before going in. How it reveals itself to you and how it reveals elements of its characters and the plot and elements from the opening scene that don't make any sense at first, that aren't like recontextualized until 2 hours into the movie. I think it's a really masterfully paced film in the way that it is so focused and minimalist, but also uses sort of the external structure of being at home and being in this mountainous region to kind of give a little bit of a twist to the courtroom drama. So I thought this was a phenomenal movie. I'm a big fan of the genre, so it was really easy to pull me in once I realized what was going on. But yeah, great movie. Great movie.
Abram, you're making a face that looks like you want to speak.
Yeah,
next,
I mean, I really loved Anatomy of a Fall. I, again, was not particularly familiar with the film, and I'm still not that familiar with really anybody involved in it, which was pretty exciting, stepping into sort of a pocket of French cinema I know basically nothing about.
Yeah.
And I came on the other side extremely impressed. I think that Anatomy of a Fall is an absolute, to steal Tanner's word because I got to go before him, an absolute barn burner of a script.
Yeah, you did say it multiple times last night.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I think that the film's mastery sort of is made apparent through, to use a quest word, its subtleism.
Nice.
Because we find ourselves sort of enmeshed in these extremely long scenes that are often just comprised of very basic reverse shot choreography, but you end up being so taken by the action of the film because the script is basically impeccable, I think, and all of our performances are incredibly committed. So I did the whole, gamer lean 45 degrees forward in the chair for the overwhelming majority of the film because I think it is just such an extremely beautiful example of how to take what is ostensibly a very simple plot and a very simple premise and stretch it out into something that's very contemplative, maybe, I guess you can say.
Yeah.
I think, and we were remarking about this last night, the film is not necessarily that concerned with if it's a murder or a suicide. There's a lot more at play on a character level, and it's really that work which makes this, in my opinion, one of the clear best films of 2023.
Yeah. Unlike you gentlemen, I #did my own research. I knew what this film was about. I'm dialed into the Oscar conversation this year. I know what it's being lauded about and the whole business. So I knew that yes, it was a courtroom drama about whether this woman murdered her husband or not, and that Sandra Hüller was getting rave reviews in her performance of this film, and it lived up to all of that anticipation for me. I do believe that Sandra Hüller is one of the best performances of this year. I do believe that Anatomy of a Fall is one of the greatest films that I've seen this year. But as Abram mentioned, and as we talked about, it's not so much about the event that happened. It is far more concerned with the moral character of its main character, also named Sandra, and the nature of relationships and how they can fall apart and how things can be twisted in either direction. And the lens that we are looking through that through is a murder, is a literal courtroom where she is on trial for her behavior over the years and years that she's been in the marriage with her husband. And then you bring in such fascinating characters like her son, Danielle, who is partially blind, and that has some quite unique thematic repercussions, as well as like plot line repercussions as well. So yeah, it just works all the way through. It's a 2.5 hour film that flies by because it is so engrossing and fantastic, and it gets you on the edge of your seat. And like knows exactly when to dole out another nugget of information that'll last you the next 35 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. I echo what a lot of you guys
Movie
have to
over.
say. I enjoyed this
Boom.
film.
We did it.
Boom. I liked it quite a bit. I thought that while the conception and the setup is so simple, that the places that the film ends up going are so varied and so interesting, that I think that there's a ton to talk about in what is this film trying to say and what is this
Yeah.
film about beyond just who did the murder. And the way that it takes the simple, the step of the murder doesn't have enough evidence, and so this trial becomes a question of character and looking into trying to figure out, could Sandra have done this, or did the husband commit suicide? This is like a plot level that becomes very interesting, and I find all the other elements of the film to just be so quality. It's just an extremely well-made movie. I mean, there's lots of this movie's great on the sound front. This movie's got a lot of great
Yeah,
silent
I was thinking
moments.
about you.
And I also found yeah, yeah. I was thinking, and this movie is particularly well lit. I think that we've. I'm talking
I
about
agree, Abram.
Coda
I
as a
agree,
movie
Abram.
that
I
we
agree, Timo.
reviewed. Coda was a movie that I was a little underwhelmed by the lighting on as a winner, so to speak. But this movie just is beautifully lit and in a subtleistic way, in a way that isn't like screaming like I am cinema, watch me, watch my
Sure, yeah.
sparkles, like. But it's like
Unlike that hack
it's just
Christopher
like
Nolan.
beautiful.
I am cinema, watch me sparkle.
Yeah.
No, but I do think that is a great point, and one of the things that really stood out to me about the filmmaking of Anatomy of Fall is how focused it is, but how it does subvert your expectations just in a sprinkling of moments. And I found those sprinkling moments to really feel very fresh, and primarily that comes for me in the relatively static camera work that this movie employs for the vast majority of its runtime. Is just the shots you expect of the people in the crowd or the person at the box or people at home, and it's very steady, and there's not a lot of tracking shots, and it's very simple framing. But occasionally, in like fleeting seconds, the camera will be like lifted out of that rigid structure, and we get handheld footage. We get a diegetic footage of people who are filming interrogations or filming conversations, and it just comes in quick moments. But I really love how the film doesn't feel like it needs to be this the entire time, and it's able to sort of jar you out of its flow by changing the camera work just for a couple of shots and then returning you back to that. And that always like kept me on my toes in a really unique way. And it's a kind of unique filmmaking choice that you don't see many people take. It's just like, oh, how about like 4% of the time we're using like handheld documentary style footage. Not enough to where it's like most of the movie or even a significant part of it. It's just like,
Yeah.
boom, we'll just throw it in every once in a while. I really like that.
It's a lot like.
But this
Go
is
ahead, Timo. Sorry.
this is a thematic idea in the movie that is being displayed through the filmmaking, is that many times we get to see events unfold like through cell phone cameras. We get to see lots of like quote unquote archival footage that is, it's all been created for the movie, but it's made to look like it's filmed on like a crappy camcorder or on a TV camera, not like it uses the medium to kind of distance ourselves from moments that make at least me view those specific instances through another lens of artificiality, through like this in yet another, I think, media, because I think the media in this movie begins to play as the trial develops an important issue. It becomes not necessarily the central focus of the film, but a very unique twist on why these characters act how they do in the trial. Sandra not wanting to go afoul of the media, and the media presence surrounding it kind of making it into a bigger deal than it really is. So, yes, the filmmaking really supports a lot of what's going on in the story and in the themes. And I noticed that and wanted to add it alongside what you said earlier.
It's very similar to the camera work in a little TV show you might know as Succession, where it is, it's done in this documentarian style where it feels like we're watching, the true events of something like this. And it even does cross that line, as you were mentioning, where we are just looking, where it looks exactly like news camera footage of that we've seen many times with people, rushing out of a courtroom and the cameras are in their face and we're trying to get them and get the in quotes from them, stuff like that. But it also will, as Tucker mentioned, snap into moments where we're doing like a crash zoom on somebody, or we're sort of like pivoting the camera back and forth as the prosecution and the defense both question Danielle, and it's those moments that like really snap you to attention in what Justine Triet is doing here. I think this is a fantastically directed film, not only from those creative decisions, but in the way that she pulls performances out of her actors, and how she intersplices and edits and knows when to cut and end a scene or let a scene just play out. And again, like I said, just doling out the information, and she knows how to perfectly pace that scene. I believe it's Abram or Tucker who said that this film is so expertly paced that it's
Could have been one of us. Could have been both of us.
I get you guys confused all the time. But it is so expertly paced in how we stagger the scenes where we're at home, and then we have these prolonged trial scenes that really feel emotionally grueling, like they are for Sandra.
Yeah, I think that
They really make you feel like you're on trial.
Fair enough. I think what you ended with, Tanner, is sort of a filmic move that I always really like. I mean, one of the most famous examples is at the end of Goodfellas, as the editing begins to mirror the sort of coked out psychological state of Henry Hill. Yeah. And through what are fairly subtle but also very intentional and very filmic choices, you sort of become very much enmeshed in sort of the headspace of the character. And I think you're totally right about the fact that I think just through editing, we sort of portray the myopia of how much this trial takes over the life of Sandra. Because as you're saying, there are these beautiful sequences of sort of interpersonal connection with Vincent, the lawyer, or with her son in between these trial sequences. But the editing is a lot faster. The scenes are a lot shorter. And then we end up back into the courtroom every time, and those scenes just carry on. And I don't mean carry on in a way that they feel poorly paced, but it's very intentional. Just as maybe Scorsese wanted to speed through the end of Goodfellas, we want to really slow down the trial. And what we want to do when we're editing is, as you're mentioning, jump back in time. I think that the most masterful sequence in the entire film is towards the end of it, when we get the video recording of the fight.
Yeah, of course.
And
audio
right,
recording. It is.
Yes.
If it were a video recording, it would be very.
Yes.
Yeah, because we see that in flashback, except for choice moment where we stop seeing the flashback and let the audio play out only. Yes.
Yeah, it was a little Freudian slip, I guess, because the film so expertly moves us from that audio recording in the courtroom back to the moment in the kitchen, and then out of it at just a precise moment, because we don't see the domestic abuse, we just hear it. And so it plays and the entire film is concerned with this, it plays very well into this often blurred line between subjective opinion and objective reality. And this notion of reality being subservient to the prevailing opinion, I think is very critical to what this film is trying to illustrate. It's even really said to us at the end of the...
Maybe, perhaps... It's said to us. It's perhaps the thesis of the movie.
Sure. And so I just think it's really effective how, on a filmmaking level, we talk about it maybe being a little bit simpler in some ways, but I think that there's actually an absolute shit ton going on, particularly from an editing perspective, and even from a camera perspective, that is quite irregular and quite artificial, but purposely artificial. And I think that is why this doesn't feel 2.5 hours long. Because it might, even if it's static for a reason. If we're cutting fast, it's for a reason. Everything is very, very deliberate, and I think that is really why this works.
I just love that scene that you mentioned, Abram, where we go into.
Yeah, let's talk about this scene, because this is like maybe the best.
I think it is the crown jewel.
It's
of the
just
film.
really good.
It's where Sandra Hüller's acting clip is going to come from,
absolutely.
And because she is so electric in this scene. We start out where. It's sort of like a microcosm of her whole deal in the movie of like, did she do it or did she not do it? Did she do it.com? Got a plug at the beginning of the film.
Before the neon credit, which is like, maybe I was thinking about that URL the whole time the movie was going on. I was like, did she do it.com?
It's got a nice ring to it. Anyway, what was I saying? wherein you always feel that she is holding something back. And,
Sure.
I guess we are meant to feel suspicious of her. I think Justine Triet does want us to feel suspicious of her. She wants to create this air of mystery around, did Sandra, kill her husband or didn't she? And I think the film does sort of, and putting myself in the mind of a juror, I think the events of the film and the events that are laid out before us are pretty clear cut, but I digress. The scene itself, Sandra starts out being just quite removed, I would say, being being
Emotionally distant.
emotionally distant. That she's taking the very logical path about things, and I'll even say dismissing her husband and his feelings.
Yeah.
But as
You're talking about the
the audio
recording
recording.
of
Yes.
the argument. The audio recording, yeah.
She can be dismissive, but at the same time, he seems to be, she brings out good points against him, and so it seems to be kind of on this equal footing where he and his name. Do we remember the husband's name? Samuel.
Yeah,
thank
Samuel.
They do say it quite a bit, actually.
you. Yeah, where Samuel is, he is raising the stakes of this whole argument himself. And then there's the moment where she comes alive in this argument, and that's like it's just before we cut to back out to the courtroom.
Yeah, it's like maybe like 2.5 minutes before that.
Exactly, and she is getting in his face and screaming, and they're screaming at each other. And I know that it can be hacky and sort of played out to be like, oh, the scene where the characters are screaming at each other, that's the best acting in the movie. But I think it kind of is, because you get to see her be like that for the first time in the movie. The rest of the time, she's quite controlled.
It's very well earned.
She's very well
Yeah.
controlled. She's very, sort of lenient, not lenient, but relaxed, I would say, and sort of
Yeah, kind of just going with the flow.
and not wanting to have those peaks of emotion because she knows that would maybe indict
bad
her.
light.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh.
But it is that scene that really, really wows you.
There is also something interesting to be said on a script level for why that feels earned. It's because before or as Sandra's getting indicted and like the first act of the film, we learn that there is a tape.
Yes.
But we don't know
Yeah.
we don't know what the tape
Yeah.
is, and the tape is mentioned to the press by who you would assume is either the chief of police or the mayor, saying I can't say more about the tape now, but and that is enough to
It's Justine Triet doing the same thing.
Yeah.
I can't show you too much now,
Yeah.
but you just wait.
Wait
You just
till this cool scene that's coming.
Yeah.
yeah, and it sort of plants this seed in your head of the tape is going to come and that shoe is going to drop.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why, to your point, Timo, it feels earned. But at the same time, on just a straightforward acting level opposed to a scripting level, the way the two of them bounce off of each other and they are in like this orbit so
Yeah.
perfectly throughout that sequence, and it builds an intensity and ferocity very naturally.
It just, yeah. That scene just made me think that throughout many moments in the film, that I've been kind of paying attention to this in all the movies I've watched, but the progression of the scene, how the scene starts in one place and 5, 6, 10 minutes later, we end up in this totally different position. And I think that this fight scene is the ultimate example of that in this film, but it actually happens a lot. And there's a lot of scenes that just play out in extended length. And I found myself going, wow, I'm remembering back to where this began, and we have come a long way in the span of just one uninterrupted moment of time. So
Well, I think that's actually an
That is-
interesting microcosm of kind of where I started my discussion of this film, is how it reveals itself to you over the course of its runtime. And of course, as you're saying, even within sequences, it can be you start in one place and you don't quite know what people are thinking, what's going on, what happened, what their history is, whether that is between two characters or Sandra talking to the room, talking to the court and the judge and the jurors and all that. But I think that it is the quiet mystery of this movie that really draws me to it. Is we're dropped into the middle of a conversation with two characters that we have no idea who they are. We don't know what why they're talking to one another. We don't know who else is there, where they are, what their history is. And frankly, even by the end of the film, I still had some questions. And I think this film is very distant from its characters, and I think that's intentional because it puts you in the shoes of someone who is a juror, right? Where we're supposed to be judging: did she do it? Did she not? And the distance that it takes from the characters by not giving them super explicit backstories and having things come out in like tangential ways of having to hide things or explain things to other people by well, you're not quite telling the entire story. You never quite know what anything is in this movie, or if any of it is like 100% true. And I think that is, again, started from the very beginning of the film where no context is given. And it isn't until key moments in the film where you learn, okay, her son had an accident. Okay, she cheated on her husband. Okay, he maybe committed suicide or committed attempted suicide in the past. These are things that are like very softly and subtly laid throughout the script and characters' interactions, but you almost feel like you're like missing them. They're like there's like little bumps, like, oh, was there a suicide? Oh, did she cheat in the past? And like you're like kind of picks up on it in the performances in the script, but you're not quite sure until that it comes out in those explosive moments. And I think it is just like imagine an onion, and the onion, believe it or not, has got layers like this movie does.
Does the onions have layers?
Like an ogre, actually.
Oh, okay.
But I'm sorry, I should have used the other
Yeah.
side of that coin. But instead of peeling the onion back like one layer at a time slowly, it's like you see the onion and then suddenly whoosh, you ripped off an entire layer. Whoa, what the hell happened here? And you have to like recalibrate yourself and like backfeed the new information that you've gotten in that really quick moment of revelation to the other moments that you saw before. It's like, oh, that's why she acted that way. That's why that object was focused on, or this person reacted in that way. I think that's really, really clever in terms of pacing it out and always keeping you on edge, because you always feel like you're 3 steps removed from knowing the truth of the situation, even when you're watching her at home. You were seeing her in her own bed and talking to her son. This should be the most intimate we've ever been with a character, but you still don't feel like you know her exactly. And I think that's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, right, is that as an audience, we're in a very peculiar position, right? Because in some ways, we're a voyeur or a juror, I guess you could put it. But we also spend so much time with Sandra. We begin the narrative with her. But what's quite compelling is that, again, on a script level, there's a very interesting exchange when Vincent comes to the house for the first time to appraise the situation. Yeah. And they're sitting down and they're eating and they're talking about, okay, what is our narrative here? And Vincent says, well, we're going to have to play this as a suicide. Yeah. Because nobody is going to believe he just fell. And from the very beginning, from this first sequence, the narrative is establishing that the characters that we're listening to do not believe Sandra implicitly. And so as an audience, we don't really either. And so we're in this very compelling position where the character we follow is also the character who continues to become less and less trustworthy as the narrative progresses. And we begin to, in some ways, lose a lot of sympathy for her, or at least I did as a viewer.
Yeah, because at the beginning of the film, she's a mother whose husband died. And you're like, oh, that's sorry. Like, I'm sorry. Jeez, that's terrible. But then you realize, oh, maybe this and maybe that. And you start to lose, like, the implicit reaction is, it's tough that your husband died. Or that's a not a relatable thing, but like an empathetic thing of you connect to the character on that way, even though you don't know that much about her. But that is kind of stripped away as the movie goes. I think it's really fascinating.
Especially because we get to a position where largely the information being posited by both the prosecution and defense is not something that we as audience members are prepared for. So we begin to lose more and more of an understanding of Sandra as a character. And what's quite compelling, if we can begin to deviate a little bit into theme, is
quest time. Here we go.
Even what ends up ultimately, if we are just to follow the events of the narrative, acquitting Sandra, which is the testimony of her son, as the prosecution says, it is in no way, shape, or form based in fact. And so,
it's, even before that, it's not based in fact, because we get the woman who's caring for Daniel telling him that you don't know the fact. You have to choose what you believe, and that becomes the fact.
Yeah, and that puts the entire film in what I feel is almost a very bitter position, which is why it is so, I think, magnetic. Because we're not here to sort of overcome a jury that doesn't realize that Sandra is innocent. If they just get that one piece of evidence, they'll see. That's not the effect that I think that the film has on the viewer.
Especially because you can't tell which direction the film is leaning. in terms of the way it's presenting her
It's
and the
int-
information that it's revealing.
It's interesting. I'd actually be curious to hear what you think about this, Timo, because we talked about this a little bit after the film. But I
Mhm.
do feel like until Daniel's testimony, she looks extremely guilty.
Yeah.
I think that is the way
Well,
that
it
the
weaves
film
in and out,
presents it.
I would say.
I would say it leans more towards the murder side. What do you think, Timo?
I think so, but I think the film is careful to present its evidence for the prosecution in a similarly
that's
shaky
what I mean,
way.
yeah.
We spent some time diving into what the only real evidence for it being an actual murder is the blood splatter on the shed, and how that
Head has to be
while
80 centimeters
one
out.
one expert says it certainly had to have come from a head impact. The other expert says ain't no way it came from that. I think that the way that this film both plays with evidence that is supposed to that we're so used to. This is like a genre deconstruction in the post-truth
Yes.
era of a
Yeah.
courtroom drama. Like, that's what this movie is really getting into, is that we have an extraordinarily difficult time knowing what is really true and what is really not. Kind of ultimately because there isn't really any objective truth
Yeah.
for a lot of this, because there's so much information missing. And so as a whole, I'm kind of coming to a thesis about this film that it is really about this formation of reality from objective witness, or
Yes,
from a
yes.
subjective witness, and that the reality is basically formed by subjectivity, and that these experts can posit ideas about what they think really happened, but then ultimately they can't rule out the other side. Each expert says, well, it's highly improbable, but is it
Yeah,
impossible?
that's constantly asked.
I said improbable.
Yeah. Well,
Yes. And so just all this uncertainty in the film, I think, mirrors the uncertainty in the real world, and the way that the internet makes it so that we don't really truly know what's actually true anymore. We just have to choose something and believe in it, like the film asks of Daniel at the
I
end.
want to hop in here and just comment on what was all said here, because we were talking about what we think happened and all that, because I find myself disagreeing. I think
Sure.
I feel that the film either implicitly or explicitly, on purpose or not, displays her as pretty innocent. I think, like, there are questions posed, of course, but I don't know if it's Sandra Hüller's performance, but she never seems outwardly murderous. And I think it's even the main prosecutor, as portrayed by, just give me a moment here, Antoine Reinhardt. I think it's how he's portrayed as well. He appears villainous. He's in like a large red cloak, and he's
kind of
like
got that like Ava Gabor haircut going on.
his head is shaved, and all of his attempts to sort of like get the sort of like persuade the jury to his side seem underhanded, frankly. The thing of, he brings out the book and he's like, oh, clearly she wrote this book about how she was going to murder her husband, and that seems, it seems a stretch logically.
This is what he reminds me of. The villain from Skylanders.
Well, sorry, where was I going with this? But yeah, he brings out the book, that whole thing.
Yeah.
He like uses Sandra's sexuality against her as like evidence in court. So at that point, I was like, we're not supposed to side with the prosecution in any way, shape, or form. And we do spend time with her, and we I mean, at least I did, sort of empathize with her position being a member of this very broken marriage.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I ever viewed her as outwardly malicious or murderous. So at that point, I have to end up siding with her. And just briefly, I want to mention, Timo, I think your observation about how it's a courtroom drama in a postmodern, post-truth sort of world, and how it does deconstruct the genre a little bit, and bringing in and sort of like taking apart these genre conventions of like, well, we got the expert, and the expert's going to come in and he's going to drop a bombshell of evidence.
Yeah.
But instead, it does this where it's like, we got two experts. They say opposite things, and while neither is completely probable, neither is completely impossible. And the film has a lot of comments about how you sort of like look at what happened and you have to form your own facts about what happened, and that's kind of how memory works. And
Yeah.
Witness testimony and all that is quite unreliable.
Well, especially because all the characters that are given, we're seeing given testimony, none of them are absolutely sure
Exactly.
about what they're saying. None of the testimony is 100% reliable because in multiple cases throughout the film, testimony is changed or gone back on. It's like, actually, it was a missed memory. So, some moment unveiled a little bit of thought about that. So testimony is not reliable. And very explicitly, I think, as Timo was mentioning earlier, the evidence presented is not reliable because the two pieces of evidence that we have that are like very concrete and are actually like within the bounds of this could have had an impact on the death of her husband is the recording, which, as we've talked about, is very open to interpretation. And because there's no video and we didn't see, we have to rely on
because
these
it is
things. Exactly.
Sound.
Let's get to the sound in a second.
Bro.
But the other one, as Timo mentioned earlier, again, is the blood splatter. But that's actual evidence. That is forensic. That is the body slid this far, and the blood splatter had to have come from this angle. And we see them doing the autopsy on the body at the beginning. But even though there's like actual physical proof of something happening, you have to infer.
It's not helpful at all.
No, it's not. Basically, none of it's helpful.
Yeah.
Basically, nothing.
It's just more question marks. It's just more question marks.
Yeah, which makes the trial devolve into this
Yes.
like information dragging, muck raking kind of point that it ends at with the bringing of the books and the sexuality of Sandra, making the trial kind of grow outside of the bounds of maybe
You can't
legality
prove
and
the
justice
logistics, so you have to prove the motive. That's essentially what they land
And it's
on.
actually the least about the fall.
Yeah.
The fall, it starts it, but quickly we realize who the fuck knows. Let's get into other things.
Yeah, it honestly is like they have to prove that Sandra would want to murder her husband and would do it as morally.
Well, here's the thing, also, because I hear what you guys are saying, but I just don't agree. And, and I think let's go back to ninth grade for a second.
All right, here we go.
Anatomy of a Fall. The title Anatomy of a Fall is not about the fall out of the window.
What? Abram, were you telling me it might be about a marriage falling apart?
I'm not even talking about that.
Okay.
If you can follow me all the way down this bridge,
We're getting to deeper levels.
if you can follow me all the way down this very deep symbolic bridge, the fall that we were seeing the anatomy of is of Sandra.
What? Oh, I see.
And here's ultimately the thing: you guys are right about how the prosecution's the prosecution's attack against the defense is weak in these key ways, and that's very obvious in the film. But the reason, to me, she feels guilty is because, as you were saying, the trial is not about the fact of the matter.
Yeah.
The trial is about her character, and they ruin her character. And I think that the film very interestingly gives a judge in the case who is not that vocal throughout the film, has a couple particular sequences where they are of consequence, but the judge is clearly quite aligned with the prosecution, allowing lines of inquiry to the chagrin of the defense, like about the books, like about her sexuality, to go through. I think that what the film does is it paints this very clear picture of an immoral woman. Sure. Now, I think that's obviously very intentional in the ways that the film is commenting on the obviously unfair trial that is being put in front of Sandra. But I think that the function on a rhetorical level of the trial is to show that guilt. And the film ultimately is, in my opinion, affirming that with the very blatant scene when both Daniel and Sandra are watching the Good Morning America style show.
Good Morning France.
Good Morning France, probably, where the host says, well, the story of the writer killing her husband is a lot more interesting than the husband than a teacher committing suicide.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the film is about the sensationalism.
Of course.
Yeah.
And it's about constructing a scenario in which this woman, who this is spelled out quite implicitly, of a lot of social prominence, a recognizable name. It's essentially
the film opens on her being interviewed.
Yeah. It's about her unraveling in a structure.
What other film with a lead female who unravels opens with her?
I did mention that it kind of felt like Guitar of this year.
Yeah.
I do think though, I want to drill in on the Good Morning France, as we're referring to. We don't have a fucking idea what that thing is called.
Yeah.
GMF, maybe.
That scene in that specific quote that you're saying, the story of the author killing her husband is more interesting than the lonely school teacher who committed suicide. I think I actually read that the opposite way, in that it's the wanting to side with this sensationalism that gives it the value of, yeah, she probably did it. You want that to be true because it's more interesting. I think I side a little bit more with Tanner in terms of the film presenting a woman who is immoral, but the question then becomes, is that immorality in her infidelity, in her potential abuse of her husband, does that connect in your mind to the point where she would commit a murder? And where I don't think that it draws that connection completely. And the reason I think it goes against that is everything's so shaky, and the idea that your mind wants to associate her with a murder because that's the more interesting story. I think that's really why it's shaky to me, is the truth isn't often as sensational as you want it to be. And I think by stating that, the movie's like, yeah, maybe you should question whether just because it's a super interesting narrative to have it happen that way, it did happen that way. Why are you reading it this way? Maybe there is a little bit, maybe it's not as crazy as it seems.
Maybe he did just fall.
Maybe he just fell out of the window.
Yeah.
It's the very first note that I took was, it's kind of Occam's razor, the movie.
Yeah.
Occam's window?
Like there is that little. They spend a little bit. Occam's window, great. There's the little bit of proof where they're like, well, if he would have hit the edge of the thing, the blood splatter would have gone on there, and then, oh look, we tested it, and it would have melted away. You wouldn't.
I really like that single moment of evidence of showing the time lapse. I'm like, this is why they're experts.
Exactly.
Because I never would have thought of that.
the material evidence that is brought, while we say, it is sort of like deconstructing the genre convention of the courtroom drama, where it's like, you can't really prove anything with it. You can bring an expert out to say anything, really. But it's still fucking fun to watch. The time lapse is fun to watch. Yeah. I mean,
them dropping the
body at the window. Yeah.
Or I think another one of my favorite sequences, when Daniel they're testing Daniel's hearing to see if he would be able to hear.
Yes, of course.
If they're shouting. It actually brings me back to 12 Angry Men, another one of my favorite movies of all time, and where, like, if you could have possibly heard this with the sounds in the environment and trying to recreate that, and is it believable? That, I mean, it's if you're drawing inspiration from 12 Angry Men, you're already
doing something right.
You're already hitting me right here.
Yeah. Well, I want to drill into the sound a little bit, because I want to go back to our fight scene and just how masterfully conceived this moment is. This actual sequence.
It's an action sequence.
of action sequence in sound, and how the way that this film uses sound as a kind of ambiguous medium, as something that we don't quite know what's going on, and how the defense asks Sandra to explain what happens in the audio, but I think, being a sound designer, you could have said anything she could have said whatever.
Well, especially because no one else in that room is a sound designer. They don't know, like, they can't remember, oh, this hit and the glass smashing, so in that order that would make sense with what she's saying.
Well, I think Timo's talking about the very first conversation that she recounts to them, and that's when they're like, when they get the people to reenact the first conversation that Daniel's hearing.
Yes, that's one of them, to test the hearing. I think that goes to the sound is important to understanding this case, and to Daniel's character. I think Daniel's character is primarily a sound-based character. A great performance. Maybe my favorite performance of the movie. No, but I am talking about the later scene in which there's the fight that happens in the audio. Just the way that it plays out in that clip is masterfully put together. It is a visceral sounding. They must have faked the domestic violence, because that's how you do it in movies. You fake it. They did a very good job, because it sounds very real. And
they didn't just randomly abuse someone for the production of this film.
Well, what's interesting?
I guess they might have. We never know. Truth is all out there. Whatever.
Truth, untruth, not truth.
Most truth.
Mm-hmm.
I think
alternative facts.
Alternative facts.
Go ahead.
What's interesting also about that sequence, Timo, as I'm sure you picked up on too, is what we are looking at while we hear it.
Mhm.
We're watching the defense
Mhm.
and the prosecution receive this sound.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting seeing them react so sort of horrified to it. Not only because it's awful domestic abuse we're listening to, but again, in a film all about rhetoric, you look and see Vincent's face as he's trying to figure out, what the fuck do I do now?
Yeah.
I mean,
How am I going to spin this?
Uh-huh.
and so that's what's interesting because the image says a lot, but the image is informed by the sound. But there's this very interesting dance here where we're watching the characters try to outpace and outthink each other, and this audio recording, which goes back to our notion of the deconstruction of reality. Because if you were to just listen to that audio out of sequence, you would say, okay, well, that's domestic abuse. She is an abuser. She probably killed him. But then we watch Vincent go on this very interesting, and again, Vincent, could you find the actor's name for Vincent?
Swann Arlaud.
Jamie.
Who gives an
Swann Arlaud.
amazing performance in that post audio clip moment as we are hearing him talk about don't let yesterday define this day.
Yeah.
And there's this very interesting semantics argument that begins to unfold, and semantics ends up playing a very important part in this film as we try to determine what improbable means, or the psychiatrist explaining what suicide means in France.
Yeah.
There's
Yes,
for it,
and
Shannon.
the way that language plays a part in
Yes.
this, and how the film floats between English and French, and how our main character is not a native French speaker, and how language ultimately is one of the main things that drives that very argument and drives the couple to come to blows about
Well,
it.
it's interesting.
Yes. Yeah. The semantics and what words mean and how we interpret them and how we mean them when we say them is all very, very relevant in the trial.
It's interesting, and it's almost entirely non sequitur, but
Perfect.
but Sam Bankman-Fried,
Oh, God.
who was just sentenced to a lot of jail time for his
Our favorite,
Friend of
or
the
he's not
show.
been sentenced yet, but our favorite real life courtroom drama subject.
Yes, he's not been sentenced to an explicit period of time yet, but it will be a big one when he is. Was on the stand defending in a case where he was so obviously fucked. And it came down to his responses to a lot of questions from prosecution being like trying to define particular words.
Yeah.
And so there's a very much clear real world sense to this application in the narrative of words and their meaning and semantics. But Timo, I think you're totally right that as we're in this French courtroom, there's a layer to the language here in the foreign language versus English, which they refer to as it is in our world as a common language.
Yeah, it's
like
the,
a
it's the
bridge
middle
language.
ground. For the Sandra explains it as it's the middle ground language for their marriage. She's a native. She's a native German speaker.
German, yeah.
He is a native French speaker.
And here's what's interesting about that is that this common ground is looked down upon in the courtroom.
Yes.
She is told by Vincent, the challenge for you is to answer these questions in French. But at a certain point, she breaks that and
Yeah.
she begins speaking in English.
And she completely stops. And I think that was a really interesting moment when, obviously, I've been primed to think about language in this way as they talked about it multiple times. I think another one of those moments where it's really primed in your mind is when the woman that's taking care of Daniel shows up the first time, and she can't understand. She doesn't
She's like,
speak
you
English
have
at
to
all."
you have to speak
Yeah.
French when I'm here, so I know what you guys are saying.
Exactly. Yeah, and that like kind of makes you think. Oh, the disconnect in the understanding the language barrier can prove a significant challenge when it comes to interpreting how people are feeling, what their motives could have been. And the moment when she says, "I'm sorry, this doesn't, I don't feel like I can express this well enough in French to like fully get across." I think it's an interesting moment because in my mind I was thinking, okay, she's gonna just do this for this one explanation. They're gonna give her the pass this one time, and they're like, "All right, fine, we'll figure it out." But as far as I can remember, I think she just stops.
She just keeps going.
Yeah, she just keeps going, and, like for multiple days because that's not the last day of the
trial.
Trial. That's the word. Yeah, very easy trial. Word there. It's not the last day of the trial, but she just continues using English, and that makes you like it primed my mind to be like put in the shoes of if I didn't fully understand what this person was saying and was relying on an interpreter because there's like a woman across the room that's like speaking to a microphone to interpret it. how does that impact the jurors? How does it impact the defense? How does it impact the judge, who I believe speaks English, if I remember correctly? But then like that all of these layers like made me at least focus in on each character. What languages do they speak? How would they be interpreting this? Does the language barrier mean anything in this moment? It's a very powerful way to draw that specific element of communication that is frankly never really touched on in movies. Like the language barrier is something that's maybe like 65, but it was done really well in this movie.
I think we got to go a layer deeper though on the language point.
Onion.
Okay.
Because we are watching this as 4 young American boys, right, that speak English as our first language.
Yes. American boys.
But we have to remember
baseball.
We have to remember that when this film was released in France, the English is what's being subtitled, not the French.
And it's a significant amount of the movie.
And I think we need to think about this very carefully in how the language of the film's native audience plays into how we are positioned against Sandra.
I have a real world anecdote, but you can continue your point. Yeah.
Because ultimately, Sandra is asked to perform, and ultimately her trial is a performance. She's asked to perform in the language of the French audience. Not only the French juror audience, but the real world French audience. And this is another example for me of the fact that the film does not put us on the side of Sandra. If anything, it puts us in the eyes of the juror.
Oh, sure.
And it puts us in the context of this larger culture that is viewing and judging Sandra, opposed to somebody standing behind Sandra with the defense.
She mentions actually in that argument, I think one of the most interesting moments of the argument is when she's like, we are living in your hometown, and when I go out in the streets, I feel like everyone is judging me. And if I'm not smiling at them, and if I'm not speaking French, they are looking down upon me. I think that does kind of go to your point.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, forcing her not only out of her, obviously, she can't speak German in this context, she's in France, but forcing her into French, but then having her pull back to English, but pull back to a place where your average French person watching the film is going to have to start reading the subtitles. It again puts Sandra in this very peculiar position where there are these intentional barriers raised between the audience and a very empathetic or subjective sort of sync with her. I think that's also very important.
Well, Abram, I mentioned I have a real world anecdote here. I think that point may hold some water if you want to believe the Oscar rumor mill, because famously this film was passed over by the French committee as their official selection, their official submission for the International Feature Award at the Oscars this year. They instead gave that to a French film by the name of The Taste of Things. And as rumors would have it, apparently they passed it over because of the lack of the main character speaking French.
Yeah.
The presence of subtitles in its native country of France. And also because apparently Justine Triet said something, pretty critical of the French government with recent protests that were going on in the country. But I think it might be a confluence of those two factors. And what you had just mentioned about how maybe it's, looking at it from the context of a French audience, having to read those subtitles in a film that is set in their native country, and even Justine Triet playing to that, mentioning the language barrier, mentioning how language, and putting into the film how language and words take on different definitions. I think the whole thing about how like attempting suicide and committing suicide in French are the same thing is very interesting. Just as an example of how that language changes so much and how it can change when you take that same word and bring it into English.
Perhaps even how our understanding of language changes our very understanding of real life itself. That because of the way that words mean. Words
are just social constructs, man.
Words, they mean different things. Bro.
I want to talk about Daniel. Sure. I want to talk about Daniel.
What about Kevin?
We ought to.
No, not Kevin. I want to talk about Daniel as portrayed by Milo Machado Graner. I think, Timo, you mentioned the performance of the film for you. I mean, he's fantastic. He kind of blows you out of the water, especially when it comes to that end scene, but he is just so lovable, and like he drills directly to the heart, to your heart as an audience member. He is kind of he's the moral compass of the film,
Yeah.
I think.
No, I'd say so. Because he's the only one that doesn't have necessarily an ulterior motive. You can see the way that he is playing in and out of supporting his mother, or should he believe her?
The moment when the judge says, Daniel has some testimony that he'd like to share, so we're extending the trial out an extra day. We're extending it over the weekend.
Yeah.
And that, like, puts a pit in your stomach. Not only because, you know, whether or not you are siding with Sandra, whether or not you think she murdered her husband or not, but also just like, oh, there's a shoe looming.
Side with Sandra, and I think she killed her husband.
Tucker, then you're just an ally. You're a girl boss ally.
And you know what, Tanner?
Yeah. What was I saying? There is a shoe that Daniel is going to drop come Monday, and you have to hang with that over the weekend. And there's that scene where Sandra is at home, and she's like, "Oh well, I can stick around. You know, we don't have to interact that much." And she's basically forced out of her home to go to a hotel for the weekend. But when I say that he's the moral compass, I think it's also important to note that he's very confused for the whole film. You're sort of it's a demagnetized moral compass, let's say.
Yeah.
A useless compass.
A useless compass. Because you know what are morals, man, and we're modernists. They're postmodernists, dude. We're Marxists, man.
What are morals?
No. But like, I think he's such a fascinating character as well.
Yeah, they are actually morels.
And of course, the whole sequence with him and Snoop at the end as well that's just heartbreaking stuff there too. Of him like doing his little experiment essentially and thinking that, and like that proves to him that is the moment where, you know, when he's talking to his babysitters, like, you got to figure out your own facts, and that forms your truth essentially. That cements to him that his mom didn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting thinking about the moment when it's announced that Daniel is going to have more testimony. It's important to remember the last moment we see between Daniel and Sandra prior to this is when Sandra comes and wakes him up in the middle of the night and says, "Your mom's not a monster."
Yeah.
And
it's a little sus, Sandra. It's a little sus, I'm
it
gonna
is.
say.
And I think that's why it's effective.
Yeah.
And again, it's this very subtle setup to that payoff of there's more testimony to come. And in that moment, in that bed sequence, I think that's where Daniel and the actor for Daniel really shows his range, because there's this very like removed, it's like a dispassion or a distrust and almost a little bit of fear. There's a lot playing on his face in that moment, which I think is extremely effective. And on a performance level, it's really his range that is so exciting. But on a character level, I think it's very interesting because, again, I can't let go of the point that this movie is not about siding with Sandra. That her acquittal happens off screen.
Yes.
And the main characters the main character whose reaction we see to it is Daniel's. And what we hear underneath Daniel is not Sandra, but it's the news. The film very intentionally, if anybody aligns us with Daniel, in that Daniel probably has the closest point of view to us as the audience. In that we have some sort of more intimate relationship to Sandra.
We were with him when the event happened.
Yeah.
He was out walking the dog. We see him walking the dog and coming back to seeing his father dead on the ground.
Yeah, he in a lot of ways is that conduit for the audience. And I think that his interesting line about when after that, when Sandra does come home, when he tells Sandra, I was scared of you coming home. There's this interesting sense that I think that the most clear emotional truth that I take away from the film is that I feel very similar to Daniel in that.
Sure.
Except you don't believe that she did.
What I'm saying is that
Or the other way around.
well, but Daniel doesn't. Does Daniel? We don't necessarily know. All
Daniel might be just playing a self-preservation game. He's like, I don't want my mom to go to prison. I'll go into the foster care system. Who knows what's going to happen to me?
I mean, the reason he needs Marge's help, Marge who is appointed by the court to him, is he doesn't know. He doesn't believe in his heart that his mom is innocent. He needs the help of this person whom he refers to as not a friend, and the film very explicitly makes sure we do not see them gaining much of a relationship, to where he needs a person who is essentially entirely removed from the family to tell him what to think about his own mother. And that is why I think he is such an interesting parallel for the audience, because he too can't trust Sandra. And again, it goes back to the fact that I just don't think the film is asking us to be lockstep with this notion that the prosecution is weak.
See, go sorry,
But
Tio.
we can't trust Daniel entirely either, because he is shown to have misremembered
He's also
and
and
he's also 11,
he
but
understands this a lot better than I would expect an 11-year-old to, but he's also still
Yes.
11 years old.
He's 12 when the trial is happening.
Why? How do you know that?
Because a year passed.
because it's
Oh, I forgot. Oh,
1 year later title card.
Sorry, what are you saying, Timo? You're talking about Daniel's perspective.
Well,
yeah.
that Daniel's perspective is also infallible. And so the film, while it is fallible. Yes, I spoke wrong. That by aligning ourselves with Daniel, I think it makes us cast doubt on ourselves. I think we come around to aligning with Daniel, though. It's part of our it is part of our transformation, and Daniel's character progression in the film is that he starts a lot less like trustworthy. We seem to not very much believe what he has to say because of this little misremembering incident, but by the time we get to the end of the film and we've seen him go through this transformation of coming to his own mind about it and saying, well, I don't really know, but now I have my basis of belief that tells me what the facts are. I think we're kind of supposed to mirror his progression in knowing what happened, through never knowing what happened. We never really know what went on, but we can come to a belief just as he did.
Yeah. Is there anything else we want to talk about? Let me skim my notes here. Let me see if there's anything. I mean, this movie also just has some great lines. I want to point out. I mean, we were talking about the impossible, improbable thing. I was waiting for someone to drop in the "What's possible that I'll be president someday" line.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Oh, I mean, there's just one that like just opens you up to the movie at very early when Vincent shows up and he's like, he just plainly says, "This trial is not about truth."
Yeah.
This trial is not about truth.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any other notes while I'm looking through mine here?
Well, I did mention the lighting earlier. I just want to talk about how effortless it is, and how I noticed in the trial scene mostly how there seemed to be this nice like golden warm glow on Sandra's face that was coming from a invisible shaft somewhere else. That just
some window really high up on the other side of the building.
Yeah, like some window. No, it's actually from a Fresnel on an HMI. And another point in the movie when they're standing in front of these glass doors, I think it's actually Samuel's standing in front of the glass door. It might be in the fight flashback, or I might be in a different part of the film, but it's just like the door is totally blown out. The outdoors are super bright, and he's kind of being silhouetted almost, but we can see some definition of what face he's making. And he's just in this halo, very beautiful, very low-key lighting, not in the technical sense, but just like it doesn't call too much attention to itself, but it also is beautiful and is also supporting the story and is really working towards what the characters are meaning and directing our eye towards where we're supposed to be looking in the frame.
The lighting,
really well
I
done.
think, combines really well with another element of this film that is very subtle but gives it a very distinct flavor, which is the fact that it is set in a mountainous region and it is very snowy and very cold out, and everything's very white. And the backgrounds outside the windows are really tall mountains and fields of snow. And it's kind of hard to tell how isolated they are at this place, or how safe it is to go outside. I really like the subtle choice to make it set during like deep wintertime with lots of snow. We never actually, I don't think we ever see it snowing. It's just the snow is just
It's
a fixture
omnipresent,
of this landscape. That gives it a visual flavor. And I think that's really, really distinct.
Couple lighting moments that I want to mention, Timo, since you brought it up. The conversation, I think it's after the first prolonged trial sequence, where it's Vincent and Sandra sort of talking outside about, their thoughts on what happened. And Sandra even kind of clues us in that she doesn't really trust Vincent at that point either. There's not a lot of trust to go around in this film, I would say. But they're both like underlit as they're having this conversation, and the light's catching their breath in the air, and it looks really great.
Yeah.
It's there. That one's at
exactly,
night, right? they're kind of like standing outside
Yeah.
a house or something in the snow.
And that immediately following that is Daniel talking to Marge while he's in bed, and there's just like this nice like circle like U shape of light on his face that's like right there just to illuminate his face a little bit, and it's like very expressive but also very grounded. Like it's not like, oh, where the hell could this light be coming from? It's like it's coming from a window, but it's just framed very nicely right onto his face there.
Yeah, except if you're to look at the reverse of that actual set, ain't no
It's
way
a key grip with a
window
mirror
like
up
that.
there. Yeah. I'll see if they have anything else here. Oh, I mean, I wanted to mention it with Daniel, but when he says of his dad and the conversation that he has with him in the car, taking the dog to the vet, and he's like, I now understand that he was talking about himself.
Great line.
That's a fucking killer moment, dude. Because you see it coming. It's like as he's retelling the story, he's like, oh, the dad's talking about himself, and he's like, oh, Daniel realizes that too. And to Tucker's point, he's matured a lot as a result of this. He's kind of had to understand things.
But is he really talking about himself? I mean, this is what
That's
Daniel
fair, that's
believes,
fair.
but that's because what he's heard in the trial. And is what is said in the trial
That's
the
fair.
truth, or is it only little tiny parts of the truth? I think that, another moment that proves the ambiguous greatness of this movie.
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting film because I don't feel like we have effectively really gotten into it thematically. Not that I necessarily want to now, but just because I think that this is a film that really invites more viewings to get deeper into. Because
We'll do it on the Quest proper review.
Yeah, when
In-
we
in-
talk
in
about the
about
Best
4
Picture,
months.
Best Picture nominees.
because I think that this film, I think that the world that the film creates beyond what we see is so rich. I really think that Sandra's position as an author of status is very fascinating. I think that the fact that it's 50 Cent's pimp is the recurrent motif.
PIMP.
I
It's
apologize.
it's an
PIMP.
abbreviation. It's an acronym.
I think that that's very important and obviously very deliberate. You could have chosen any instrumental track, and we go with that.
Yeah.
There is a
Mary
very
had a little lamp.
could have, but I don't think that
Royalty
would
free. Didn't have to pay 50
royalty
cents.
free. I think that wouldn't have
much you pay?
supported.
Approximately,
Have $1.
yeah.
I don't think another song would have supported what is pretty clearly also an examination of a female character in a very misogynist
Of course.
court system.
Uh-huh.
Now, the film even makes an allusion to this,
It's a very
cluing,
misogynistic song.
trying to clue you into what the film is saying. But I think that there is so much to be said and to unpack and understand in this film through the lens solely of Sandra's occupation and the sort of opportunism of the media and press and the prosecution to involve her work and what that means, not in a dissimilar way to like how people like Young Thug got locked up, which sounds funny, and because it is funny to talk about Young Thug in a review of Anatomy of a Fall, but it is quite serious. In fact, this notion of marginalized people's work becoming a point of a vector of attack on them. I think that I just didn't receive everything from this film yet,
Sure.
and I think that's why it's quite amazing. It reminds me a lot of when we reviewed Drive My Car on Quest One, and I felt like.
Oh, another movie that I've been thinking about
That's
recently.
prime.
I've been thinking about
Yeah,
that movie.
it's a phenomenal film, and it wasn't until my second viewing of that for class that I felt like I was getting it.
Sure.
And I feel like Anatomy of the Fall I get a lot of, but I think that this film goes a lot deeper than it's about trying to find some sort of reality or in a perspective to hold on to when truth disappears. I think that there's a lot about power and hierarchy that I'll be excited to get deeper into and notice closer when I come back for
If
Quest.
the Academy has the good sense to nominate it for Best Picture, that is.
If they don't,
They should listen to us. We know what we're
Hey,
talking about.
we have,
outrageous.
the honest to God truth is we've seen more Best Picture winners than
Probably most of the Academy.
No, I would say
Most voting members.
maybe all of them. Like the chance that that any of the Academy voting board members sat down and watched 96 of these fucking movies is so impossible.
There's got to be at least one.
There's got to be a few of them.
Yeah.
But it's
We'll get
There's gotta be.
we'll get them on the show. We'll get them
Yeah.
on the show.
I
Let's interview all of
think that we ought to put a score on
yeah.
this film. But while we put that up, we got to go around the horn. You guys, some of you
Oh, sure.
indicated, did she kill her? Did she kill her husband, or did she not?
For
I
my
know it's
vote,
not
go to
about that, but-
didshedouit.com
put a
/BLB.
what are you doing there?
I don't know.
Is there a voting thing?
I don't know. I haven't looked at it.
Is it a fucking straw poll?
I don't know. I haven't gone to that URL yet.
I don't think Sandra murdered her husband.
No, I don't think so either.
I think she
think she
did.
did.
Okay, well, we're split. A hell of a jury we would be, I guess.
Yeah.
It would be a hung jury.
Split house always falls. So.
I do have some quick
Divided.
2023 Cannes Film Festival facts. I'll try to fly through it here.
Yes. Who? Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so-
Give it to us.
2023.
Straight to the veins.
We know it well, don't we? Do we not? Jury president Ruben Östlund. We know him. We love him
Yeah.
as the director of Triangle of
Oh,
Sadness.
Yeah. One of his favorite directors.
We love him, but we love it.
Other notable jury members include everyone's favorite Riddler, Paul Dano.
Oh, I think it was
Oh,
Scott.
nice. Everyone's favorite.
Julia Ducournau, director of Titan.
Yeah.
Brie Larson.
Oh, everyone's favorite star of the flop of the year.
Yeah, everyone say it. Yeah. Denis Menochet, who is, if you're familiar with the film *Inglourious Bastards*, he's a French actor. His most popular will be as the father or like the head of household at the beginning of *Inglourious Bastards*.
Oh,
And then,
that guy. Okay,
Mariam Touzani, who is the director of sort of a hit film from last year, hit indie foreign film called *The Blue Kaftan*. There were 21 films in competition that year. The opening film was the return of Johnny Depp in Jean du Barry, a French film. And the closing film, Elemental.
Oh yeah, and it got terrible reviews.
Yeah.
But it was also awesome.
Indiana
It
Jones
made
is
$1 billion.
also there.
Indiana Jones was there as well, Dial of Destiny. Other notable submissions in the official competition category,
Destiny.
not Dial of Destiny. About Dry Grasses, Asteroid City, La Chimera, May December, and Perfect Days.
Sure.
The second place, other films, and these are the second and third place. Second place went to Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest, the movie that Tucker thought this might have been.
Oops.
And third place went to Fallen Leaves, which I believe what we're actually getting here. It's
Okay.
It was like an hour and 20 minutes long. I'm like, oh, thank God. It's like 80 minutes long. Of course I'm going to go see that. Yeah. I am ready for a score if you
Beautiful.
fellas are.
Yeah, I have mine punched in. Are you guys ready?
Wait,
In
no,
3,
it won't let me type on here. Okay, hold on.
Ooh, 2 3/4.
I'm done.
I hit my number.
How do I-
Boop, 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 boop.
Boom.
Nice.
Okay. We've got 4 numbers. We've got a score. The average is 9.1.
Yeah, woo! Timo, insert stock party sound effect here. Yay! Timo.
The stock
It's
child
like that-
cheer
Yeah,
sound
exactly
effect.
that one.
Yeah. 9.1 is going to put Anatomy of a Fall at spot number 2 on our list of 3 Palme d'Or winners. The point breakdown is starting from the bottom. I gave it an 8.4, which is kind of actually a bit of an outlier now that I'm looking at it. Tucker and Tanner both gave it a 9.2, and then Abram gave it a 9.7. So Abram is really liking it. I thought it was great, but I don't know. It
It's good.
wasn't like
Life's good. It could be better.
outstanding.
That's fair. That's
Yes, yeah, it was, yeah. And then Tucker and Tanner gave it very
Lockstep.
solid 9.2s.
I would say that goes slightly above solid. I would say that's one of the better scores you can possibly get.
Uh-huh.
I'd say it's up there.
It's up there.
Yeah.
And so is the film.
Yeah, that's up there.
Second place.
That's up
Out
there.
of 3.
This is a damn good movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next week, Barton Fink number
Okay.
1.
Barton
Can't wait.
Stink.
Well,
Stop saying that.
Barton
This is a
Stink.
serious review show.
part ends. Next time, we are going to stick to our promise to the random number wheel and talk about Barton Fink. Until then, stay warm, keep cool, and peace.